The morning sun cast long shadows across the ancient stone courtyard as hundreds of people gathered in complete silence. Not a single whisper broke through the crisp autumn air. Every eye was fixed on the heavy oak doors that stood at the entrance of Westminster Abbey. The crowd had been waiting for nearly 2 hours, but nobody complained. They knew something important was about to happen. Catherine Middleton stood behind those doors, her heart racing faster than it ever had before. She could hear the muffled sounds of the crowd outside, thousands of people who had come to witness this moment. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed down the front of her elegant navy dress. She had been preparing for this day for weeks, but now that it was here, the weight of it all felt overwhelming. Beside her stood Prince William, tall and composed in his military uniform. But if you looked closely, you could see the slight tension in his jaw, the way his fingers drummed quietly against his leg. He was nervous too, though he would never admit it. This was not a wedding. This was not a celebration. This was something far more serious, something that would change the course of their lives forever. The palace had kept the details quiet for months. Rumors had swirled through London like autumn leaves in the wind. Some people said the Queen was stepping down. Others whispered about a major announcement concerning the future of the monarchy. The newspapers had printed endless speculation, but nobody knew the truth. Only a small circle of trusted advisors and family members understood what was really about to happen. William turned to Catherine and took her hand. His palm was warm against her cold fingers. They exchanged a look that spoke volumes without a single word. In that moment, Catherine remembered the first time she had truly understood what marrying into the royal family would mean. It was not just about fancy dinners and beautiful gowns. It was about duty, sacrifice, and carrying the weight of a nation on your shoulders. She thought back to a conversation they had just 3 nights ago. They were sitting in their private residence, the children finally asleep upstairs. William had been staring into the fireplace for nearly an hour, barely speaking. Catherine had sat beside him, waiting. She had learned early in their marriage that sometimes William needed silence to process his thoughts. Finally, he had turned to her with tears in his eyes. Real tears which she had only seen a handful of times in all their years together. He told her he was scared. Scared of failing, scared of letting down his grandmother, his father, and the millions of people who believed in the monarchy. But most of all, he was scared of what this responsibility would do to their family, to their children, to the quiet, normal life they had fought so hard to maintain. Catherine had held his hand that night, just as he was holding hers now. She told him something her mother had once told her when she was struggling with public attention. She said that strength is not about never being afraid. Strength is about moving forward even when fear threatens to paralyze you. She reminded him that they were a team, that whatever came next, they would face it together. The doors began to creak open slowly. The sound echoed through the courtyard like thunder. The crowd outside collectively held their breath. Catherine felt William squeeze her hand one more time before releasing it. They had to walk out separately, following centuries-old protocol. But even though they would not be touching, Catherine knew they were walking out together in every way that mattered. The sunlight hit her face first, warm and blinding. She blinked rapidly, her eyes adjusting to the brightness after the dim interior of the abbey. As her vision cleared, she saw them. Thousands of faces all turned toward her and William. People of all ages, from elderly women who remembered the Queen's coronation to young children perched on their parents' shoulders. They were all completely silent, watching with an intensity that made Catherine's breath catch in her throat. William stepped forward first, his military boots clicking against the ancient stone. Catherine followed 3 paces behind as tradition demanded. They moved in perfect synchronization, their training evident in every step. This was not natural for either of them. William had always been more comfortable in casual settings, flying helicopters or playing with his children. Catherine had never sought the spotlight, preferring quiet family dinners to grand public events. But duty had called, and they had answered. As they reached the center of the courtyard, a platform had been erected, draped in deep crimson fabric embroidered with gold thread. Standing there were members of the Privy Council, religious leaders, and senior members of Parliament. At the very center stood the Archbishop of Canterbury, his weathered face solemn and kind in equal measure. The Archbishop raised his hand, and if possible, the silence grew even deeper. It was as if the entire world had stopped breathing. Catherine could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She could see a young girl in the front row, maybe 7 or 8 years old, clutching a small Union Jack flag. The girl's eyes were wide with wonder and excitement. William reached the steps of the platform and turned slightly, waiting for Catherine. This small gesture was not part of the official protocol, but it was so perfectly William. Even in the most formal moments, he found ways to show that they were partners. Catherine climbed the steps, and they stood side by side, facing the crowd. The Archbishop began to speak, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard with remarkable clarity. He spoke of duty and service, of the ancient traditions that had guided the monarchy through centuries of change. He spoke of the challenges facing the modern world and the need for leadership that was both rooted in tradition and open to progress. Catherine listened to every word, but part of her mind wandered to her children. George, Charlotte, and Louis were inside, being cared for by their nanny. They were too young to fully understand what was happening today, but their lives were about to change in ways Catherine could hardly imagine. She had promised them that morning, with fierce determination in her voice, that no matter what responsibilities came their way, family would always come first. The Archbishop's voice rose slightly, drawing Catherine back to the present moment. He was reaching the crucial part of the ceremony. William stood perfectly still beside her, but she could sense the emotion radiating from him. This was the moment that would define the rest of their lives. This was the moment when everything would change forever. The crowd remained absolutely silent, but Catherine could feel their energy, their hope, their expectations pressing in from all sides. The weight of history sat heavy on her shoulders, but as she glanced at William, she felt something else too. She felt ready. The Archbishop extended his hand toward a velvet cushion held by a young priest. On it lay 2 ancient scrolls, their edges yellowed with age, the seals of previous monarchs still visible in faded wax. These documents had been prepared in secret over the past 6 months, drafted and redrafted by the finest legal minds in the country. They represented something that had not happened in British history for over a century. Catherine's mind flashed back to the moment when she had first learned what these scrolls contained. It was late January, and she and William had been summoned to Windsor Castle for a private meeting with the Queen. The drive from Kensington Palace had been tense and quiet. William had gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. They both knew this was not a routine family visit. When they arrived, the Queen was not in her usual sitting room. Instead, they were led to a small private study that Catherine had never seen before. The room was lined with portraits of past monarchs, their stern faces seeming to judge everyone who entered. The Queen sat behind an antique desk, looking smaller and more fragile than Catherine had ever seen her. What happened in that room over the next 3 hours changed everything. The Queen spoke with a clarity and directness that left no room for misunderstanding. She explained that the world was changing rapidly, and the monarchy needed to change with it or risk becoming irrelevant. She talked about the challenges facing the institution, the declining public support among younger generations, and the growing questions about the monarchy's purpose in modern society. Then she said something that made both William and Catherine freeze in their seats. She wanted to create a new position, something unprecedented in royal history. She wanted to establish a formal regency, but not because of her health or inability to rule. She wanted to do it because she believed William and Catherine represented the future the monarchy needed. She wanted them to step forward now while she could still guide them, rather than waiting until it was too late. William had immediately protested. His voice had cracked with emotion as he explained that he was not ready, that he needed more time, that the traditional order of succession should be respected. His father Charles was next in line. How could they possibly bypass him? What would that mean for the family? What would it mean for the institution itself? The Queen had listened patiently, her hands folded in her lap. When William finished, she had smiled sadly and explained that Charles knew about the plan. In fact, it had been partially his idea. Charles understood that the public connected with William and Catherine in a way they never had with him. He loved his son enough to put the future of the monarchy above his own desires for the crown. Catherine remembered how her whole body had gone numb during that conversation. She had never imagined this scenario, never prepared for it mentally or emotionally. She had expected to have decades before facing this level of responsibility. She had thought there would be time to learn gradually, to ease into the role, to let her children grow up with some semblance of normal childhood before the full weight of royal duty descended upon them. Now, standing on this platform with thousands of eyes watching her every move, those memories felt like they had happened in another lifetime. The Archbishop was reading from the first scroll, his voice steady and formal. He spoke of the unique circumstances that had led to this moment, of the careful deliberation and consultation that had preceded this decision. William stood perfectly still beside her, but Catherine knew him well enough to read the subtle signs of his inner turmoil. The slight tightening around his eyes, the way he held his shoulders just a fraction too rigid, the almost imperceptible movement of his jaw. He was fighting to maintain his composure, to project the strength and confidence that everyone expected from him. The crowd remained silent, but Catherine could see people leaning forward, straining to hear every word. Some held their phones up, recording this historic moment. Others simply watched with wide eyes, understanding that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for generations. The Archbishop finished reading the first scroll and carefully placed it back on the cushion. He reached for the second one, and Catherine felt her heart rate spike. This was the scroll that contained the specific details of what was about to happen. This was the document that would formalize the unprecedented arrangement. As the Archbishop began reading the second scroll, Catherine's thoughts drifted to a conversation she had with her sister Pippa just last week. They had met secretly at a small cottage in the countryside, away from prying eyes and listening ears. Pippa had held her hands across the wooden table and asked her the question that Catherine had been asking herself every day since January. Was she absolutely sure she wanted to do this? Was she certain that this was the right path, not just for the monarchy or for the country, but for herself and her family? Pippa reminded her that once this decision was made public, there would be no going back. The weight of it would be permanent, the scrutiny relentless, the sacrifices enormous. Catherine had looked her sister in the eyes and given the only answer she could. She told Pippa that she had married William, knowing that his life was not his own, that it belonged to duty and tradition and the people of the United Kingdom. She had chosen that life with open eyes, even though it scared her. And now, when that duty called earlier than expected, she could not turn away, not because she was fearless, but because she believed in something bigger than herself. The Archbishop's voice grew stronger as he reached the crucial paragraph in the scroll. This was it. This was the moment when the theoretical became real, when months of secret planning became public reality. Catherine could feel the energy in the courtyard shift intensify. People who had been standing for hours seemed to find new reserves of attention and focus. William turned slightly toward Catherine, and their eyes met for just a second. In that brief glance, Catherine saw everything she needed to see. She saw his fear, yes, but she also saw his determination. She saw the boy who had lost his mother too young, and promised himself he would protect his own family at all costs. She saw the man who had struggled with his role in life but had finally made peace with his destiny. She saw her husband, her partner, the father of her children, standing on the edge of a precipice but ready to jump. The Archbishop paused, letting his words sink in. The silence was so complete that Catherine could hear birds singing in the trees beyond the courtyard walls. She could hear the rustling of fabric as someone in the crowd shifted their weight. She could hear her own breathing, steady and deep, as she prepared herself for what came next. Then the Archbishop spoke the words that everyone had been waiting to hear. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. The Archbishop had just announced that William and Catherine would assume full royal duties immediately, serving as co-regents alongside the Queen. They would not replace her, but they would share her responsibilities, represent the crown at major events, and gradually take on the decision-making authority that had traditionally belonged to the monarch alone. The crowd erupted. The silence that had held everyone captive for so long shattered into a wave of sound that rolled across the courtyard like thunder. Some people cheered. Others gasped in surprise. A few began to cry, overcome by the emotion of the moment. Catherine saw the young girl with the Union Jack flag jumping up and down, waving her flag frantically in the air. But not everyone was celebrating. Catherine could see clusters of people who stood with their arms crossed, their faces clouded with uncertainty or disapproval. This was not a universally popular decision. Many people felt strongly that the traditional line of succession should be honored. They believed Charles had earned his turn to lead, that he deserved the opportunity after waiting his entire life. The fact that he had agreed to step aside did not make it easier for them to accept. William raised his hand and gradually the noise began to subside. He stepped forward to a microphone that had been set up at the edge of the platform. Catherine could see his chest rise and fall as he took a deep breath. This speech had been written and rewritten dozens of times over the past month. Every word had been carefully chosen, debated, and refined. But Catherine knew that William had also prepared some personal remarks. Words that came from his heart rather than from the palace speechwriters. He began to speak, and his voice carried clearly across the courtyard. He thanked the Archbishop, the members of the Privy Council, and everyone who had gathered to witness this historic moment. He acknowledged the unusual nature of what was happening, the break from centuries of tradition. His voice was steady, but Catherine could hear the emotion underneath each word. Then William did something unexpected. He paused and looked directly at the section of the crowd where he had seen people with concerned or disapproving faces. He spoke directly to them, acknowledging their doubts and concerns. He said he understood their feelings because he shared many of them himself. He admitted that he had questioned whether this was the right decision, whether he was ready for this responsibility, whether it was fair to ask his family to make these sacrifices. The honesty in his voice was striking. This was not the typical royal speech full of formal language and diplomatic phrases. This was William speaking as a real person, a husband and father who was struggling with an impossible choice. Catherine felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. She blinked them back, knowing that cameras were capturing her every expression. William continued, explaining that this decision had not been made lightly or quickly. He talked about the months of consultation with constitutional experts, religious leaders, and representatives from all parts of the United Kingdom. He mentioned the private conversations with family members, including his father, who had shown extraordinary grace and selflessness in supporting this transition. Then William said something that made Catherine's heart swell with pride. He talked about what the monarchy meant in the modern world. He said it was not about power or privilege, though those things came with the position. It was about service. It was about representing the best values of the nation, about bringing people together across differences, about providing stability and continuity in times of rapid change. He spoke about his grandmother, the Queen who had dedicated her entire life to this service. He talked about the example she had set, the way she had guided the country through decades of transformation while remaining true to the core principles of the monarchy. He said that he and Catherine hoped to honor that example by bringing their own perspectives and experiences to the role, by connecting with younger generations while respecting the traditions that gave the institution its foundation. The crowd was completely silent again, hanging on his every word. Even the people who had seemed disapproving earlier were listening intently. William had a gift for connecting with people when he spoke from the heart, and this was one of those moments when his sincerity was impossible to doubt. He turned to Catherine then, gesturing for her to join him at the microphone. This had not been part of the planned ceremony. Catherine felt a flash of panic. She had not prepared a speech. She had assumed William would handle all the public remarks, but as she looked into his eyes, she understood what he was asking. He was asking her to speak not as a duchess or a future queen, but as herself. As Catherine, she stepped forward, her legs feeling unsteady beneath the elegant dress. The microphone seemed impossibly close and impossibly far away at the same time. She could see her reflection in the lens of a camera directly in front of the platform. She looked pale, her eyes wide with nerves, but she also looked determined. Catherine began to speak, and she was surprised by how steady her voice sounded. She talked about her background, about growing up in a normal family without any connection to royalty. She admitted that she had never imagined being in this position, that even after marrying William, she had assumed she would have many more years to prepare for major royal responsibilities. She spoke about her children, and her voice softened with emotion. She said that George, Charlotte, and Louis were the reason she and William had struggled so deeply with this decision. They wanted to give their children as normal a childhood as possible, to let them play and learn and grow without the constant weight of public scrutiny. But they had ultimately decided that serving the country and the monarchy was more important than their personal comfort. Then Catherine said something that surprised even herself. She talked about the people she had met over the years during royal visits and charity work. She mentioned a woman she had spoken with at a hospital just 2 months ago, a single mother who was working 2 jobs while caring for an elderly parent. That woman had looked exhausted and overwhelmed, but she had taken time to thank Catherine for visiting, to say that seeing the royal family gave her hope that things could get better. Catherine's voice cracked slightly as she explained that this was what service meant to her. It meant showing up for people even when it was hard, even when she was tired or scared or unsure. It meant being a symbol of continuity and hope, even if she did not always feel worthy of that role. It meant doing her best to represent the values of compassion, dedication, and integrity that she believed the monarchy should stand for. The crowd was completely still as Catherine finished speaking. She stepped back from the microphone, her heart pounding. She had no idea if her words had helped or hurt the situation. She had just spoken from the heart, letting her true feelings show in a way that royal protocol usually did not allow. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The crowd erupted into applause that started softly but quickly built into a roar. People were not just clapping politely out of obligation. They were cheering with genuine emotion. Catherine could see tears streaming down faces in the crowd, could see people hugging each other, could see the young girl with the flag now being held by her father as she waved enthusiastically. Even the people who had looked skeptical earlier seemed moved by Catherine's honesty. There was something powerful about her vulnerability, about her willingness to admit her fears and doubts while still committing to move forward. It made her real in a way that royal figures rarely seem to the public. The Archbishop stepped forward again and the applause gradually subsided. He had one more ceremonial duty to perform before the official proceedings concluded. From beneath his robes, he produced 2 medallions on golden chains. These were newly created symbols of the co-regency, designed specifically for William and Catherine. Each medallion bore the royal coat of arms on one side and a new emblem on the other, a design that represented the unity of tradition and progress. William bowed his head as the Archbishop placed the medallion around his neck. Catherine did the same, feeling the weight of the gold chain settle against her collarbone. It was surprisingly heavy, and she could not help but think of the symbolic weight it represented. This physical burden was nothing compared to the responsibilities they were accepting. As the Archbishop stepped back, the bells of Westminster Abbey began to ring. The sound cascaded across London, a traditional signal that something momentous had occurred. Other churches throughout the city joined in, creating a symphony of bells that echoed off buildings and rolled through streets. People who had not attended the ceremony looked up from their daily routines, realizing that history was being made. Catherine and William descended the platform steps together. Protocol had been adjusted for this new situation. They would walk side by side rather than in the traditional hierarchical arrangement. This small change spoke volumes about the nature of their partnership and the modernization they hoped to bring to the institution. As they walked through the crowd toward the waiting vehicles, people pressed forward, reaching out their hands. Security personnel tensed, but William and Catherine both instinctively moved toward the barriers, wanting to connect with the people who had come to support them. Catherine shook hands with elderly women who told her they had waited since dawn to be there. She accepted flowers from children who stared at her with wide, awestruck eyes. One elderly man gripped her hand tightly and said something that Catherine would remember for the rest of her life. He told her that he had seen the Queen's coronation as a young boy, and he had worried that the magic of the monarchy would die with her generation. But seeing William and Catherine step forward gave him hope that the institution could survive and thrive in the modern world. The drive back to Kensington Palace was quiet. William and Catherine sat in the back of the car, neither speaking, both processing what had just happened. The weight of the moment was settling over them like a heavy blanket. They had crossed a line. There was no going back to the life they had known just hours before. When they arrived home, their children were waiting in the private sitting room with their nanny. George, as the eldest at 12 years old, seemed to understand the significance of the day more than his younger siblings. He stood up formally when his parents entered, as if he instinctively knew that something fundamental had changed in their family dynamic. Catherine immediately crossed the room and pulled all 3 children into a tight embrace. She needed to feel them close to remind herself why she and William had ultimately agreed to this path. Charlotte wrapped her arms around her mother's neck and asked if Mummy was now going to be queen. Catherine gently explained that she was not the queen, but she would be helping the queen with important work. Louis, only 7 years old, seemed more interested in the medallion around his mother's neck than in the larger implications of the day. He reached out to touch it, his small fingers tracing the engraved design. Catherine lifted the chain over her head and let him examine it more closely, grateful for his innocent perspective that reduced the monumental ceremony to a simple piece of interesting jewelry. That evening, after the children were in bed, Catherine and William sat together in their private study. The television was on, showing news coverage of the day's events. Every channel was analyzing the ceremony, debating its implications, interviewing constitutional experts and historians. The consensus seemed to be that William and Catherine had handled the moment with grace and authenticity, but there were plenty of voices raising concerns about the precedent being set. William turned off the television, unable to watch anymore. He poured himself a whiskey, something he rarely did, and stood by the window looking out at the dark gardens. Catherine joined him, slipping her hand into his. They stood in silence for a long time, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, William spoke. He said he kept thinking about his mother, about what Diana would think of this day. Would she be proud? Would she be worried? Would she think they were making a terrible mistake? His voice was thick with emotion, and Catherine could see the pain in his eyes even in the dim light. Catherine told him something she had never shared before. She admitted that she often thought about Diana too, especially when facing difficult decisions. She had never met William's mother, but she had studied her life, her approach to charity work, her ability to connect with ordinary people. Catherine said she tried to honor Diana's legacy by bringing that same warmth and genuine care to her own royal work. William turned to face Catherine fully, and there were tears running down his cheeks. He told her that he could not do this without her, that the only reason he had been able to stand on that platform and accept this responsibility was because he knew she would be beside him every step of the way. He said that his greatest fear was not failing the country or the monarchy. His greatest fear was failing her and their children. Catherine wiped the tears from his face and told him that they would figure it out together. They would make mistakes, certainly. They would face criticism and challenges that they could not even imagine yet. But they would face it all as a team, as partners, as two people who had chosen each other and would keep choosing each other through whatever came next. They stayed by that window for another hour, talking through their fears and hopes, making promises to each other about how they would protect their family while serving their country. They talked about the kind of leaders they wanted to be, the changes they hoped to make, the traditions they wanted to preserve, and the ones they thought needed to evolve. The next morning brought a new reality that hit Catherine like a wave as soon as she opened her eyes. The schedule that had been delivered to their room the night before sat on her bedside table, and it was overwhelming. Back-to-back meetings with government officials, briefings on international situations, consultations with senior advisors, and public appearances that had been hastily arranged to maintain the momentum from yesterday's announcement. William was already awake, sitting in the chair by the window with a stack of briefing papers on his lap. He looked tired, like he had not slept much. Catherine knew he had probably been awake since 4 or 5 in the morning, his mind racing with everything they needed to learn and do. She got out of bed and kissed the top of his head, then went to check on the children before starting her own day. George was already dressed in his school uniform, sitting at the breakfast table with a serious expression on his face. He had clearly been reading the newspapers, which were spread across the table with headlines about his parents. One read, "A new era begins," while another asked, "Can they handle it?" George looked up at his mother with worried eyes and asked if everything was going to be different now. Catherine sat down beside him and took his hand. She admitted that yes, some things would change. There would be more security, more attention from the media, more demands on the family's time. But she promised him that the most important things would stay the same. They would still have family dinners. They would still go on holiday together. She and William would still be at his school events whenever possible. They would still be a family first before anything else. George seemed somewhat reassured, but Catherine could see the anxiety still lingering in his eyes. He was old enough to understand that his parents' new role would affect him too, that his own future was being shaped by decisions he had no control over. It broke Catherine's heart a little, but she reminded herself that this was the reality they had been born into. Better to face it with honesty than to pretend it was something other than what it was. The first few weeks were brutal. Catherine had always worked hard in her royal duties, but this was different. The intensity was relentless, the learning curve steep, the scrutiny constant. Every decision she and William made was analyzed and criticized by experts and commentators. Every public appearance was dissected for meaning and symbolism. Every word they spoke was examined for hidden messages or implications. There were moments when Catherine locked herself in the bathroom just to cry for a few minutes, overwhelmed by the pressure and the fear that she was not good enough for this role. There were nights when she and William argued, tension and exhaustion fraying their normally strong partnership. There were mornings when she wanted to stay in bed and hide from all of it, but there were also moments of unexpected grace. During a visit to a children's hospital, a little girl undergoing cancer treatment told Catherine that seeing her on television had made her feel brave. The girl said if Catherine could face scary things and keep smiling, then she could too. Catherine had to fight back tears as she held the child's small hand. At a meeting with business leaders about economic policy, one of the older executives admitted he had been skeptical about the co-regency arrangement. But after working with William and Catherine on several initiatives, he said he had come to believe they brought a fresh perspective that the country desperately needed. He appreciated their willingness to listen and learn, rather than pretending to have all the answers. 3 months into their new role, Catherine and William attended their first major state dinner. Foreign dignitaries from around the world had gathered to celebrate a trade agreement, and William and Catherine were hosting alongside the Queen. Catherine wore a stunning emerald gown that had been custom-made for the occasion, and she had spent hours learning the proper protocols and conversation topics for each guest. During the dinner, she was seated next to a president from a small European nation. He was charming and well-educated, and they had an engaging conversation about education reform and environmental policy. But midway through the main course, he leaned over and spoke quietly to Catherine, his voice sincere and kind. He told her that he had been watching her and William over the past few months with great interest. He said what impressed him most was not their polish or their formal diplomatic skills, which would come with time. What impressed him was their obvious commitment to each other and their genuine desire to serve. He said those qualities were rare in leaders, and they were more valuable than any amount of training or experience. Catherine thanked him, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. It was exactly the kind of encouragement she needed at that moment, when she still felt like she was drowning in new responsibilities and expectations. Later that night, after the dinner had ended and all the guests had departed, Catherine and William walked through the empty ballroom. Their footsteps echoed on the polished floor. The tables were being cleared by staff, the flowers and decorations being carefully packed away. In a few hours, the room would be restored to its normal state, all evidence of the grand event erased. William pulled Catherine into his arms and began to dance slowly, even though there was no music. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. They swayed together in the quiet room, finding a moment of peace in the midst of chaos. William whispered that he was proud of her, that she had been magnificent tonight. Catherine laughed softly and said she had almost knocked over the wineglass of a foreign minister and had completely forgotten the name of an ambassador's wife. But William insisted that those small mistakes did not matter. What mattered was that she had been herself, warm and genuine and interested in everyone she met. As they continued to dance in the empty ballroom, Catherine thought about how far they had come in just a few months. She thought about the terrified woman who had stood behind those oak doors at Westminster Abbey, her hands trembling and her heart racing. That woman had felt so unprepared, so uncertain, so afraid of failing. Catherine realized that she still felt many of those same fears. The difference was that now she knew feeling scared did not mean she was failing. It just meant she cared enough to worry about doing things right. The real failure would be giving up, letting the fear win, refusing to try because perfection was impossible. She pulled back slightly to look up at William's face. In his eyes, she could see the same exhaustion and determination that she felt, but she could also see love and partnership and a quiet confidence that had not been there 3 months ago. They were learning together, growing together, becoming the leaders they needed to be. 6 months had passed since that historic day at Westminster Abbey. The leaves were changing colors again, autumn returning in its steady cycle. Catherine stood at the window of the palace study, looking out at the gardens where tourists were taking photographs and children were playing. So much had changed, yet life continued with its normal rhythm. The British public had largely embraced the co-regency after the initial shock wore off. Polls showed strong support for William and Catherine, particularly among younger generations who appreciated their modern approach to royal duties. There were still critics, of course, and probably always would be, but the overall response had been more positive than anyone had dared to hope. William entered the study carrying a folder of papers and 2 cups of tea. He handed one to Catherine and kissed her cheek before settling into the chair at his desk. This had become their routine. These quiet morning moments before the day's chaos began. They would review their schedules, discuss upcoming challenges, and simply be together as husband and wife before they had to be the Duke and Duchess carrying the weight of the nation. Catherine mentioned that she had received a letter from the woman she had spoken about during her speech, the single mother from the hospital visit. The woman had written to thank Catherine for sharing her story, and to say that seeing someone in Catherine's position acknowledge ordinary people's struggles had meant more than she could express. The letter was several pages long, filled with details about the woman's life, her hopes for her children, her gratitude for the healthcare system that had helped her father. William smiled and said he had received similar letters, hundreds of them actually, people writing to share their stories, to express their support, to offer advice and encouragement. He admitted that reading those letters was sometimes the hardest part of his day, because they reminded him of the enormous responsibility they had accepted. Every decision they made, every policy they supported or questioned, affected real people with real lives and real struggles. The intercom on the desk buzzed, and a voice informed them that their first meeting would begin in 15 minutes. Catherine finished her tea and smoothed down her dress. She caught her reflection in the window and paused for a moment. The woman looking back at her seemed different from the one who had stood trembling behind those oak doors 6 months ago. There was something in her eyes now, a steadiness that had been earned through trial and difficulty. The meeting was with education ministers to discuss reforms to the school system. This was an area Catherine felt passionate about, and she had spent weeks preparing for this discussion. As she and William walked down the corridor toward the conference room, she felt her confidence growing with each step. She had ideas to contribute, questions to ask, perspectives that came from being a mother as well as a public figure. The meeting went well, better than Catherine had expected. The ministers listened respectfully to her suggestions about early childhood education and mental health support in schools. Several of them engaged with her ideas thoughtfully, building on them rather than dismissing them. When the meeting concluded, one of the senior ministers approached Catherine privately. He told her that he had been one of the people who questioned the co-regency arrangement when it was first announced. He had worried that William and Catherine were too young, too inexperienced, too modern in their thinking to effectively share royal responsibilities. But after working with them over the past months, his opinion had completely changed. He said they brought energy and fresh thinking that the monarchy desperately needed, while still respecting the traditions and protocols that gave the institution its foundation. Catherine thanked him sincerely, feeling a rush of validation. These small acknowledgments meant everything during moments of doubt. They were proof that the sacrifice and struggle were making a difference, that she and William were not just playing at being leaders but actually growing into the role. That afternoon, Catherine had a private audience with the Queen. These meetings had become a weekly occurrence, opportunities for the Queen to mentor Catherine and share the wisdom of her 7 decades of service. Catherine treasured these conversations more than almost anything else in her new role. The Queen had a way of cutting through complexity to reveal simple truths, of putting challenges into perspective that made them feel manageable. Today, the Queen wanted to talk about something personal. She told Catherine that she had been watching her and William closely over the past 6 months, and she was immensely proud of what she saw. But she also wanted to give Catherine some advice that no one else could give. Advice that came from someone who had lived an entire lifetime in service to the crown. The Queen said that the biggest danger was not external criticism or political challenges. The biggest danger was losing yourself in the role, allowing the institution to consume your identity until nothing remained of the person you had been. She admitted that she had struggled with this throughout her reign, that there were times when she could not remember where Elizabeth the woman ended and Elizabeth the Queen began. She encouraged Catherine to protect her private self, to maintain the relationships and interests and quirks that made her who she was. She said the public did not need another perfect royal figurehead. They needed a real person who happened to hold a position of leadership and responsibility. Catherine's humanity, her vulnerability, her willingness to show emotion and admit uncertainty were not weaknesses to be hidden. They were strengths that would help modernize the monarchy and keep it relevant for future generations. Catherine left that meeting with tears in her eyes but hope in her heart. She went directly to the nursery, where Louis was playing with toy soldiers on the floor. She sat down beside him and joined his game, becoming the general of an opposing army. Louis laughed delightedly as they staged an elaborate battle, complete with sound effects and dramatic deaths. This was what the Queen had been talking about. This simple moment of being a mother, of playing on the floor with her son without worrying about dignity or image or protocol. These were the moments that kept her grounded, that reminded her who she was beyond the titles and the medallions and the ceremonial duties. That evening, the entire family gathered for dinner. No staff, no advisors, no interruptions. Just William, Catherine, George, Charlotte, and Louis around the table, sharing stories about their day. George talked excitedly about a science project at school. Charlotte described a new horse she had ridden during her lesson. Louis proudly announced that he had learned to write his full name without any spelling mistakes. After the children were in bed, Catherine and William returned to their private study. They had one more task to complete before the day ended. Together they reviewed the schedule for the following week, discussing each commitment and how they would approach it. But they also took time to mark off a full day that would be kept private, reserved for family time with no royal duties allowed to interfere. Catherine leaned back in her chair and looked at her husband. William was focused on the calendar, making notes and adjustments. His hair was slightly messy, his tie loosened, his formal facade completely dropped now that they were alone. This was the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago, before the weight of responsibility had settled so heavily on his shoulders. She thought about that day at Westminster Abbey, standing in front of thousands of people, and accepting a role she had never imagined holding. She thought about the fear that had gripped her heart, the doubts that had plagued her mind, the overwhelming sense of being completely unprepared for what lay ahead. Catherine realized now that she had been right to feel all those things. She had not been prepared. No amount of preparation could truly ready someone for this level of responsibility. But what she had not understood then was that being prepared and being capable were not the same thing. She and William had proven themselves capable, not because they were perfect or fearless, but because they were willing to learn, to adapt, to support each other, and to never stop trying to be better. The crowd had fallen silent that day as they stepped forward, and someone had said they could rule today. Catherine smiled to herself now, understanding the truth of that statement. They were ruling in their own way on their own terms. Not perfectly, not without struggles or mistakes, but with authenticity and dedication and love. And that, she was learning, was exactly what the country needed.